Good morning and Gmar Chatima Tova, Jack. It's wonderful to see you. And
It's a delight to be with you.
yeah, thank you. And I'm really thrilled that this community gets to meet you. So I can't even tell you what an honor it is. I want to begin by reading what's really too short a bio, but a condensed bio, and then ask you to expand on it, if you would, to talk about the kind of work you've done and some of the highlights, let's say, of this particular work that you've been doing all these years. So let me read, if I may. The man whom I'm introducing you to is very dear to me. I hold him in very high esteem. I think my wife knows I talk about him a lot as a mentor and as a friend and as really a gift in my life. None of that's written in his bio. What I'll read to you now is an abridged bio. Rabbi Jack Bemporad. Rabbi Jack Bemporad holds two major professional positions. The first as director of the nonprofit Center for Interreligious Understanding in New Jersey, which he founded in 1992. He's also professor and co-director of the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Studies, both at the Vatican St. Thomas Aquinas University, the Angelicum in Rome, where he's been teaching for the past 20 years. He's currently the rabbi of Congregation Micah of New Jersey in Cresskill, New Jersey. In addition, in 2016, Rabbi Bemporad became the first person ever to receive an honorary PhD in theology from the Angelicum since that university's founding in 1577.
570.
Excuse me, 577? Thank you for the correction. Over the years, he has brought imams
I'm sorry, you're right, 1577.
Over the years, he's brought imams and Muslim scholars to Auschwitz. He's worked with Christian, Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist groups. He's received honors and awards from each of them. In addition, he's authored and edited numerous books, scholarly works, and articles. Most recently, he contributed the chapter on the book of Genesis for an interpretative edition of the Hebrew Bible, published by the Hebrew Christian Fellowship Society of Rome, for which Pope Francis wrote the introduction. So that's in brief who you are. I want to just add to that first of all, my thanks to the Mankoff family, because I was heading to Istanbul and then to the Vatican in Rome, and I was heading to Istanbul for a series of high-level meetings with religious leaders there, including His All Holiness, the Patriarch Bartholomew, and leaders of various churches, and the great mosque there, and the head of the Jewish community. And I get this message before traveling from my dear friend Doug Mankoff, who says, "Ron, I have to introduce you to a wonderful, wonderful man. And Jack, the rest for us is history. But for me, more than just being a wonderful relationship, you really, first of all, guided me, because I was going into those meetings without enough information to make the most use of those great opportunities. I remember one of the things you sent me documents, which was great. I got to read them on long flights and in my hotel. And I got to Istanbul and called you and said, "Have you read this?" And I said, "Yes." "Have you read that?" "Yes." "Here's the person you're meeting, and here's the value of that meeting and potentially that relationship. And here, day by day, well, this is the person, and here's why this is an important relationship to nurture, not only personally, but on behalf of interreligious understanding, cooperation, dialogue." We were planning to meet in Rome. I already had the dates in my calendar. You had yours. I knew where I was staying, and I knew where we would meet. Well, therein comes the value of saying, with God's help,
Right.
Alevai or Bezrat Hashem will meet, because who really knew that we wouldn't be able to because of a pandemic?
Right.
So you ended up in Rome. I ended up in Sicily, having to essentially flee before the last flight out. Went via Athens and then via London, came home. You spent a long time in Rome. So that's a little background. That's what brings a smile to my face, because it's personal and we look back on it.
Yes.
But I want to ask you to fill out that bio, and particularly the work that you and I are focused on is interreligious dialogue and cooperation. And I want to ask you to talk a little about what you've done, what you've experienced, and some of the highlights in that work.
Well, let me first start with our mutual friends. First, Doug, I knew Doug when he was a little boy. He was in the religious school at Temple Emmanuel, where I
In
was the
Dallas.
rabbi. I officiated his bar mitzvah, and I saw him and even his brother Jeff just grow and thrive. And it was a joy to see how they became really wonderful, successful, really honorable human beings, which is
Yeah,
really.
indeed.
But keep in mind, when I flew down to Dallas in '72 to take on the position of rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, Ron Mankoff and Joy were there waiting at the airport to receive me. And it was sort of love at first sight. And to this day, I mean, he's on our board, the center board. He's an incredibly wonderful supporter. He was very, very helpful as president. He became president of Temple Emmanuel. And just let me say a few things about the very best people that we brought down there, because we had the wherewithal. Keep in mind, it was like 2,000 families, it's
Right.
the wherewithal to really bring people down. So we brought the finest minds, Justice Douglas, Hartshorn, who was probably the foremost theologian, Schubert Ogden, Eric Cassell, Stephen Toulmin. I mean, you name it, and we brought the people down to give lectures, and Ron really was the spearhead behind that. He said, keep your sights at the very highest, don't compromise. Let this congregation be exposed to the best thinking in every area. And to this day, he's been a tremendous help in every way. If I have any kind of an issue, where he was really instrumental in helping a number of situations with our board. And so I have nothing but love and affection for both of them. And even to this day, I remember with greatest fondness the years that I was together with the Mankoffs. They're just wonderful human beings in every way. As to what is short, well, the thing that perhaps you have to understand is that I was born in 1933, which is a long time ago. And the vast majority in Italy, in Pisa, Italy, the vast majority of Jews that were born in Europe in that year were killed. I mean, the young people were just devastated. It was a horror. And even when I went back at the age of 13, because we didn't know in 1946, we didn't know who was alive and who was dead. Uh, for example, my mother left both her parents, her sister. It was just a horrible situation. Cousins, uncles, and leaving was almost an impossibility when I think that my father had the courage to do it. And he was given an opportunity. This is very interesting. He was very, very wealthy, a millionaire. He was given the opportunity to take his wealth and move to Brazil on condition that we all become baptized. And he said, I'm not going to be the first Bemporad to abandon my faith. He felt that his integrity was more important than all the money in the world. And that became a great example to me. And my father really, and we came over here, and it was very hard for him because he didn't know the language. He really didn't have many skills except card playing because he was so wealthy, he didn't have to do anything. It was that kind of a thing. Anyhow, so when I was at Tulane, I went there because I was interested in math, and they had a great department because 7 professors from Berkeley refused to sign the loyalty oath. And so therefore, Tulane hired them all together. So I was told to go to Tulane to study math. That's what
Sorry to interrupt you, Jack. What was that loyalty oath?
Oh, during the McCarthy period, everybody in universities, basically, especially public universities, were asked to sign a loyalty oath that uh, they would not be a member of the Communist Party,
Got it. Okay.
nor try to destroy the government, revolt against
Sure.
the government. Now, the only people really who stood up to McCarthy and the Jenner Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and so forth, were the Reform rabbis. Now, I came out of an Orthodox background. So my intention was really, if I to take Judaism seriously, I had studied with Lisitsky, who was a great Hebrew poet. He happened to be living in New Orleans. And so he started teaching me, a little bit of Hebrew. I had studied Talmud with Wadi Horowitz when I was a high school student. I was very interested in Judaism. That was but I never thought of becoming a rabbi until I saw that the rabbis stood up for something, and their congregants, God bless them, let them do it, even though they were scared and they felt that it was a risk, especially if anyone had a sense of the McCarthy period. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. People were terrified to say anything. And so anyhow, that made me decide to become a rabbi. I decided that because of my own individual piety, I guess that's the way to phrase it, and also my love for Judaism. I had that as a little boy. Keep in mind, when I was 4, I was upstairs with my mother behind the screen. And then at 8, I went downstairs with my father to services. I went with him every week, It was that kind of thing. And now the thing that happened is that I was brought into the guy who was the foremost scholar in New Orleans at that time was Rabbi Sher, who was actually a Reform rabbi. So I decided, well, maybe I'll go to JTS, because I thought Reform was too much. That's too much of a transition. Right. And then what happened is that I discovered that Leo Beck was teaching at the Hebrew Union College, and that they brought the best scholars from Europe, Dr. Atlas, Taubler, Sonne, Eric Werner. They had the very best teachers. So I ended up at the Hebrew Union College, you see. Now, what got me interested in interreligious dialogue is the fact that I early came to the conclusion that the real problem with anti-Semitism is the fact that you had, both in Christianity and in Islam, a desire to separate themselves from Jews. They had to somehow justify their own existence vis-a-vis Jews. And so you have statements about Jews that were really not good. For example, when you have in Matthew, where it says, what shall we do with your king? And then the response is, we have no king but Caesar, right? Well, that was interpreted by the church fathers as saying, you see, they are, the one that they worship is Caesar. So they worship money, they worship power, not spirit, not spirituality. And then they say, well, what should we do with your king? And he says, crucify him and let the sin be on us and our children. Well, look, the reality is, however that is interpreted, it was damaging, because in Holy Week, even to this day in the Orthodox Christian tradition, you have the most venomous attacks on Jews and Judaism. But then what happened is that the Muslims, when they separated themselves from Judaism and Christianity, took over a great deal. In fact, I think it was quite clear that many of the Christians who converted to Islam brought their anti-Semitism into the Muslim world. So I came to the conclusion that the real issue with anti-Semitism was to get those people who were teaching this stuff, that were reading these texts every year at services, having, for example, preachers, especially fundamentalist preachers, condemning Judaism as of the devil and doing the devil's work, quoting John, or as Paul would say, it's strictly a flesh religion. It's not really, it's obsessive compulsive. Right. It's the law against
fixated on behavior, right?
So I felt that unless we actually do our best to try to teach Christians primarily, but then also Muslims, that their perception of Judaism is basically false. And now, what really made the difference is that in 1965, you had Nostra Aetate. Now, Nostra Aetate, our age, is an incredible document.
Can you just contextualize it for a moment?
Yeah.
So people understand what the document is and what its origin is.
Well, it's interesting because it says that we have to examine our past and see what we've said about other religions.
And the we here is the Catholic Church. This is coming from the papacy.
Now, here's an interesting thing. Going to one of the questions that I suggested we discuss, how can I be true to my faith without being false to yours? Okay. Well, here is the great innovation of the Catholic Church, and here in particular, Pope John the 23rd, because he came to the conclusion, especially, although I think he came to that conclusion before he met, a number of Jewish representatives that said, why is it that the Catholic Church is constantly teaching contempt? Jules Isaac is the most important, but he wasn't the only one. There were a number of people that approached John the 23rd and saying, why have you been teaching contempt? Is this really true? Is this what Judaism is? Keep in mind, John the 23rd was remarkable. When he was in Turkey, he passed out 20,000, I think, false baptismal certificates. When he was in France as the nuncio, he even wrote Pius XII saying, you've got to speak out against what's happening to the Jews. John the 23rd was a holy man. In every way, I had an audience with him in 1960, which completely changed my attitude towards the Catholic Church. Because here's a man who, and there was very few, there was only 14 of us. We were dealing with the battle against hunger because of a tremendous amount of poverty in those days as today.
Right.
And he spoke in French, and he started crying. I never would imagine a pope, keep in mind, I was aware of Pius XII, that here's a man who, even though he came in on a throne and it took forever, the audiences in those days is totally different than this. Just in parentheses, let me tell you a funny story. When we met with John Paul II, I had 8 audiences with John Paul II, some of which lasted over an hour. We discussed a lot of things. And then we had several audiences with Benedict XVI, who is German. So anyhow, we said, well, they're always late, so we can come a little later. Well, when we met with Benedict, he was there waiting for us. Since he was a German, he had to be on time. It's an amazing experience, Anyhow, to go back to the point, what you had was a transformation. And here's what John the 23rd basically said, not in so many words, but he said it enough. He says, I can only be true to my faith by telling the truth about what my faith did to the other faiths.
Yeah. Jack, can I interrupt you? Because I want to read your writing.
Yeah.
Something that you said about Nostra Aetate to contextualize it for people to understand the importance of this church document. Yeah. You said, I think it's important to review briefly the revolution in self-understanding with respect to Jews and Judaism that the declaration Nostra Aetate brought about. To understand the crucial importance of Vatican II and its statement about Jews and Judaism, one must remember that for many Christians, the Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, and that Christianity was seen as completely distinct from and alien to Judaism. Past Catholic teaching minimized, if not totally ignored, that Jesus was a Jew, that Mary and the apostles were Jewish, that many of the ideas that Jesus taught were Jewish ideas, and much of the terminology Jesus used was terminology current in the rabbinical Judaism of the time. So I'll just add that little parenthesis from your own writing.
That's very helpful, because I think that's exactly right. I think that actually frames it in terms of, because every one of those things you mentioned, Nostra Aetate, Vatican II, our age, tries to deal with. It isn't just that the Jews were the people of God. They are the people of God. Quoting Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 11, where it says that the gifts and calls of God to the Jews are irrevocable. For example, saying that you can't use the New Testament as in any ground for anti-Semitism. It has to be seen in its own context and so forth. It really did. And not only did he do that, what happened with actually John Paul II is that you had one document after the other underlying it and affirming it. You had the We Remember document that actually dealt with the question of the Holocaust. You had the biblical document that actually dealt with the fact that the Jews have every right to interpret their scriptures and not have to interpret it because there's only one way, and that's a Christological interpretation. And in fact, it's interesting because Ratzinger, when he was cardinal, wrote the introduction to that. It says, and not only that, it says that I found it in many ways amazing. The biblical document said that without the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament is indecipherable. And because all of the basic terms, what the Messiah, where did you get the idea?
Right, of course.
The Messianic age, you know, I mean, the whole foundation. Now, it's true that we use terms in different ways, that there's different context, there's different ways of implementing. But the one thing that Vatican II did, I want to underline this, up till that time, I don't care where you went, a religious position is the following. We have the truth and you're in error to the extent that you disagree with us.
Right.
It never occurred to anyone to say,
narrowest. Right.
It never occurred to anyone to say, we have the truth, but guess what? You may have the truth too.
Right.
And they spent a lot of time saying, look, these are all these things in Judaism that we think are true. In fact, we even have to look at Islam and say, this is true. Even the so-called pagan religions, at least they manifest a desire of human beings for the divine, for the holy, for the spiritual, for the ethical, for all those things that give life meaning. Here's what Vatican II did. Now, wouldn't it be important to take what Vatican II did and really, really build on that? And it was that that convinced me. Some years later, in those days, I was teaching at the Hebrew Union College in New York. Build on that so that we could then say to the present leadership in the Catholic Church, among other religions, and say, can we use this as a basis? Certainly the liberal Protestants did. And they, for example, the Methodists, even the Lutherans did. They, to a large extent, took that and had different statements about their attitude towards Jews and Judaism. Now, I think that the foundation of anti-Semitism is theological. That's the foundation. Why, for example, even in Egypt, and why, for example, in Greece and in Rome, was there anti-Semitism? Because Jews were primarily monotheists. They believed in one God. They did not believe in a sexual deity. They did not believe in gods and goddesses. They did not believe, in fact, you have statements, Theophrastus has the statement that the Jews are either atheists or philosophers, because you go into, they went into the temple, they didn't see any statues or anything, you know. Now, I think that first, their insistence that they have to live according to their law, their Torah, that they want to keep kosher, they want to observe the Sabbath, they observe circumcision, all these things separated themselves. They refused to participate in the sacrifices for the local deities. So they said, you're lazy, that's why you observe the Sabbath. You're cruel, that's why you have circumcision. You're crazy, that's why you have dietary laws. Who the hell wants that? So to a large extent, what happened was that the Jew was seen as separate. Now, I think that with Christianity, what happened was that you have in these texts statements that are fairly negative. Now, the good news about what the Catholic Church has done and what many Protestants have done, and to some extent even some Islamic movements have done, is to say we are contextualizing that. We're trying to take what is the true teaching and not take something that is contextual historically and stick with that. Now, that does not mean that when you have people who are intent on anti-Semitism, or for a number of political reasons may want to attack Jews, condemn Jews, and so forth, well, they will certainly use that. Right. So it's very important, I think, to work with the Catholic Church and the leadership of the Catholic Church to try to bring that about. Let me just give you a couple of examples, but please interfere, say whatever you want.
Well, I was just thinking that what you're saying and what I understand from you is here's a model in the 20th and 21st century that's so extraordinary that it can be more than an entity in itself, a relationship in itself. It can be a model for other relationships.
Right. That's exactly right.
And then what my question is, and maybe we'll get to this a little later, is how does what happens on high when religious leaders meet translate to what happens within the society?
Or I'm glad you asked that because that's central. Well, you know, you not only had Vatican II, you also had the guidelines and the notes to Vatican II.
Okay.
You also had the I wrote I wrote documents on each one of these movements. For example, the Catechism, the New Catechism, the guidelines and the notes and so forth. Well, what they say in them, and by the way, that was what actually brought about my going to the Angelicum to teach. Because what they say is that Jewish teachers, scholars, rabbis should teach in Catholic institutions, colleges, universities, but also that there should be courses in parochial schools about Jews and Judaism. It wasn't enough just to have a document. You had to have also the implementation of this document on every level of Catholic education. And here, fortunately, there were enough people in the Jewish community who I think accepted that and liked that and worked on the local level. Sister Rose Thiering, for example, who's here in Seton Hall, did her doctoral dissertation on the implementation of Vatican II, and she came out with a very marvelous study showing that next to Jewish schools, the best education about Judaism was in the parochial schools, because they developed curricula, they would bring in lecturers and things like that. Well, what happened was, to implement that, Cardinal Keeler said, would you mind going and teaching a course at the North American College in Rome, which is the college that trains priests, American priests. And I did. And what's really, I don't know how much time we have, but I can tell you an interesting story.
Yom Kippur, we have time.
We have time. Anyhow, the rector there said, Rabbi Bemporad, do you mind if I sit in on some of your classes? I said, of course, you honor me, please come. I was teaching literary prophets, okay? And he came to all the classes. I later discovered, years later, I discovered that he told his secretary, I better see what this rabbi is teaching our students. You know, I'm a little concerned, you know, maybe he's going to convert them. You know? I mean, which is absurd. Anyhow.
Right.
It turns out that we later became quite friendly. That particular Monsignor that came in is now Cardinal Dolan.
Oh.
Which is really funny, isn't it?
Yeah, but it reminds me, by the way, of a conversation that I had with Rick Hirschhout, who is the head of the, as you know, the AJC.
Right.
And somebody who also has great admiration for you, head of AJC in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I was saying to him, talking about how we come to, let's say, an agreement with the UAE and Israel. And he said, he was saying, look, here's the genesis, here's the evolution. When you come to that agreement that makes the news, years and years of relationship building have occurred to arrive at those moments.
Absolutely.
Right. And he said also a lot of the people with whom we encounter, and, you know, I'm dealing with representatives of different countries here, as many people are, you don't know where they're heading. Some of them are going to be heads of state, as you say. Some of them are going to be heads of organizations, even religious heads. So without it being manipulative, it's also just an awareness of the trajectory of people and the kind of impact that they might have on potentially the world.
Absolutely. In fact, apropos of that, I can tell you what actually gave me the idea to start the John Paul II Center at the Angelicum. You see, what happened was that Hans Jonas, who was my teacher and great friend, said they were going to be translating Kittle's word book. Now, Kittel was an anti-Semitic, although great biblical scholar in Germany in the 30s. And they're going to translate it into English. But the article on the Pharisees was so viciously anti-Semitic that Jonas said, would you mind writing that article? And I said to Jonas, I said, apart from the fact that I'm not an authority on that subject, I mean, my own training is more in medieval Jewish philosophy, you know, in Bible. But I said, why is it that it's always a Jew that has to defend Judaism? Whenever there's some kind of an attack on Judaism, you've got plenty of Christians who are scholars who could write the article on the Pharisees.
Right.
And then I said to myself, there are a lot of places where you have anti-Semitic statements where Jews aren't even allowed. So why not educate leaders in the Catholic Church and other religions who actually can be a voice for Judaism, even though they're not Jewish? And I felt that's why I held out for years. They were willing to establish this center without a trip to Israel. Right now, the John Paul II Center has almost a 2-week trip to Israel. Now, why did I think it was absolutely essential? Because I don't think that a person can fully understand what Judaism is unless they understand the relationship between Judaism as a religion and the state of Israel as some sense of an embodiment of some of the ideals, hopefully some of the ideals that Judaism stands for. So when we established that program 12 years ago, I said, look, I'm not going to participate. I'll continue to teach as a professor, but I'm not going to set up this program, get funding for this program to teach the best leadership. We get the very best. We give 10 really outstanding scholars, and we've done that now over 11 years. We got over 95 graduates, and they're doing great work in all of their teaching in universities. They're heading all kinds of organizations. And I felt that they should know enough about Judaism, enough about what Jews are about. They should know something about all these things so that they can do that work. You see, that goes along with what you were saying, namely, how do we get almost a cadre of scholars, teachers, educators, spokesmen that can say, let me tell you something, we've been to Israel. Right. What you're saying, with all of its defects, okay? Right. To say that somehow it has no right to exist, we can't participate with that, because that isn't true. I mean, I think that that's important. In fact, one of my very best teachers, one of my best students, Paola Bernardini, she loved Israel so much, when she got married, she did our honeymoon in Israel. They can't wait to go back, so, and by the way, we don't try to hide anything.
Right.
We're not hiding anything. You come, you take a look, and you see.
Right.
Another thing that I did, which I think is important along this line, is we had 2 important trips to Auschwitz. The first one with the American imams, and then the second one with world imams. And the world imams.
This was through the Angelicum or separate?
No, this is through the Center for Interreligious Understanding.
I see. Got it.
Yeah. I'm glad you clarified that. No, this is a separate thing. And in fact, now,
your own entity in New Jersey.
Now we're trying to work on a woman's trip to Auschwitz. So, but that's a separate issue. Anyhow, I invited people who had been on record denying the Holocaust. And I was attacked.
By whom?
I was attacked because they say, why are you even talking to them?
Got it.
They're anti-Semites. And I said, look, who am I going to bring to Auschwitz? People who say that it did happen and it was terrible. And let's bring those who are skeptics, and I'll take my chance on it. And I said to them, look, this has nothing to do with Israel for the simple reason that it either took place, what you see with your eyes actually happened, or not. Every single one came back not only totally shaken, but with one of the best statements condemning Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. And 2 years later, we brought world imams, okay? We even brought 2 leaders from Saudi Arabia. We brought an imam from the Palestinian Authority. And it's on my website, he even said, if the Palestinians had seen what I see, they would have a totally different attitude towards Israel. And when he went back, he was beaten up. I mean, he was treated miserably. So going back to the basic point that I'm making, and that is, how do we best educate people to what Judaism is all about? Here I would add Jews too, to what Judaism is all about, its importance, its significance, its viability, and its right to exist. Look, I'll give you another example. Here's when I was at Sacred Heart University. It was at a time that the Baptists said, we're going to devote $3 million to convert Jews. So I called the head of that group. He was in Norfolk. And I think, no, if I maybe I'm wrong. Anyhow, and I said, look, I want to be able to have a conference where you can explain to me why you want to convert me. He was absolutely astonished. He says, are you sure you want me? I said, yes. Maybe you're right, and maybe I'm wrong. You may convince me, you know. I said, I'll even bring other people. I'll bring other Jews. I'll bring Protestants, Catholics, the works. Maybe you can. He was ecstatic. And so what happened was when we went down there, you know, it was really interesting that he actually changed. When he saw that every single other member that was there were saying, no, we're not interested in destroying Jews or Judaism. And I said what I think in the thing that I gave you, I said, do you really want that Jews should cease to study their sacred text, to draw sustenance from it? Do you really think that it's better for the Jews to just somehow no longer be Jews? I mean, what happened was that I believe in talking to people who disagree with you.
Yeah.
I believe in talking to people who have a different attitude and to impress upon them the necessity that they may look at things that they have not looked at. Let me give you an example, okay? When the question came up about the conference we had in Prague in 1990, which had to do with anti-Semitism, and I met with Cardinal Cassidy. I was sent by Ichkik. At that time, I was the head of the Interreligious Committee of the Synagogue Council of America. And they sent me to meet with Cassidy. And I said to him, I said, look, when the Pope said that the Catholics and the Catholic Church is against anti-Semitism by anyone at any time, he said, absolutely. I said, well, does that include Catholics? I mean, don't you think it would be helpful for us to take a look at Catholic attitudes, the church fathers? You know? He says, I'll give it some thought. Now that was in June. In September, he came forward for the very first time and said, the way we've treated Jews impels us to ask forgiveness. And he's used the word tshuva.
Yeah.
And that became the Prague Accord, which actually was the first time in history that the Catholic Church asked forgiveness. And it was not only there, but then later in the year 2000, there was an important ceremony of forgiveness at the Vatican where they asked forgiveness. Cassidy asked forgiveness for the way they handled Jews. The head of science asked forgiveness for the way they handled Galileo, the people who were involved with the Black community, and so forth, which was amazing. And then when the Pope went to Israel, when John Paul II went to Israel, that very statement, which you'll see is in the thing I sent you on and he put this prayer into the wall.
Right.
I mean, so, you know, you have to recognize that these are important things and they should be built on. That's the point I'm making, you see?
Yeah, I see that. I see that. And I see how you're giving a great example of how one thing actually does impact the next. I had this incredible feeling, and I don't know if it's true or just my own ego experience. When I was with Pope Francis a year and a half ago or so, 2 years ago, I told you about that, and I was on the piazza, and I thought, I didn't realize until afterwards that the time I spent with him, you know, praying with him, blessing him, speaking with him, was on these giant monitors, these giant screens. And maybe, thank God, I didn't know that beforehand, but I also didn't know that I was going to meet with him. I didn't know any of the circumstances.
I think that's wonderful.
But what amazed me at the end was I was in tears, and I thought to myself, and I called my wife back in the US, and I said, I just thought about those screens. I thought, how many people of whatever faiths and traditions and beliefs saw these two people, Catholic and Jew, based on the colors of the yarmulkes, standing together, smiling at each other, actually embracing each other for the conversation. And what might it have shifted in somebody's thoughts about the other in their society, whether it's the Jew or whomever it is? I mean, that's, I think, all we can do is create these experiences for other people to experience, to align with, to engage with. I want to ask you a couple things. First of all, you make a distinction that the church makes a distinction. You make the point that the church made the distinction, and I think this was in the We Remember statement, the differentiation between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And then I want to ask you to talk a little about it. But I also know that to this date, the church hasn't adopted the internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism. I don't know if that bothers you, if you feel like it's going to happen. I don't know what your thought is of that as well, at all.
Well, I think that the distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and the reason that they make that distinction, largely has a lot to do with what happened much later, which is when you had racial anti-Judaism, and racial anti-Judaism is anti-Semitism. In other words, they don't want to mix together the anti-Judaism, which was actually a rejection of Jews for their religion, which is, I think, basically what it was originally.
And you're saying that's anti-Semitism, that's anti-Judaism, right?
Anti-Semitism is when you had, especially in German society, where they viewed themselves as the chosen race.
Right.
They, in fact, one of the things that's interesting, I think it was Stuart Chamberlain who wrote a 2-volume work proving that Jesus was an Aryan. In other words, and one of the problems that you have is that how are you going to deny that Jesus was Jewish?
Right.
And if Jews are a race that is basically vile and terrible, well, you can't say that. In fact, look, I'm told that Wagner refused to really go to church and so forth because he refused to pray to a Jew. Yeah. He was. So the point I'm making is that you have to separate anti-Judaism, which is actually the rejection and the condemnation of Jews as a religion. You see this clearly in Gnosticism, where it's the Jews that believe in this God who creates the world, who is a vile, horrible, punitive God of wrath, which is contrasted to the God that saves you, which is the true God, you see. That's basically anti-Judaism. Yeah. Anti-Semitism takes the character that is taken on when you begin with all the racial theories. And the racial theories said, well, of course, the Jews are a race, that it's a despised, vile, horrible. But then in doing that, they take over all of the negative things that the anti-Judaism had embodied. So yeah, it's a blending of the two, you see.
I kind of think that the person being pounded on the ground doesn't care what the source is, right? Is this political? Is this sociological? Is this because of Israel's existence? Is this because of the death of Jesus? It's anti-Semitism.
Well, you see, you have this sense that, look, what's interesting is that if you look at Tacitus, if you look at the early historians, the Roman historians, they also were vehemently against Christians. I mean, they attacked them in every society, pretty much with the same language that they attacked Jews. Because the Christians also did not participate in the local cults and the local deities and so forth, you see?
Yeah.
It was only when Constantine basically accepted Christianity and then later converted that then the Roman Empire was sort of blended with Christianity that it changed radically.
Jack, I want to pull us to your 3 questions. Okay, and then maybe the rest of the conversation stays in the context of those questions.
Okay.
So you say essentially, and I don't know if this is your original thought or this is your summary of other thoughts, but that doesn't matter. But it's a good one, which is that the purpose of religion is to be the conscience of society and the voice of humanity.
Correct.
And then you say, in relation to this kind of important work of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, you say that there are 3 key questions. How can I be true to my faith without at the same time being false to yours? I want to give people time to think about that.
Yes.
The second question, what's the place of faith of the other within the context of the self-understanding of my faith perspective? In other words, or i.e., what space or recognition do I give to the other from the perspective of my own faith? I think we've talked a lot about that.
Right.
How can religions work together for the common good of humanity? Before we go to those, I mean, let me just let those lie with people. Let people think about that. And I can always send this to anybody who wants to read it afterwards with your permission. We have a notion, you know, a rabbinic notion, Tosefta, that says that the righteous of all nations have a place in heaven. And you say that the New Catechism has a similar notion. It says essentially all who act ethically can be saved. It dates back, essentially they're saying, let's not go to later religion, let's go as early as the Noahide laws, right? How do you see that interacting? In other words, when we have savior-based, salvation-based religions, and then we have our own, how can we sit at the same table? And when you also have evangelicals who say essentially there's one road, one path to heaven, and maybe I'm wrong in speaking for another faith in the first place, but I'll say that as a statement. And then you have the Catholic Church that says, first of all, consider as Pope John Paul said, the Jews as our older brethren. In other words, there is an affiliation, there's a familial affiliation, but also this notion that there isn't just one path up that holy mountain. So how do we sit together? How do Catholics and Jews, Muslims and Christians of different denominations gather at a table to do something good, to be actually the conscience of the people when we have different notions of what the end goal is?
You know, that in itself is you're listing a lot of questions, not any one question, but of course, the basic problem that I see is how do you develop a language of dialogue?
Right, okay.
And unfortunately, too often, especially on the Jewish side, I must tell you, that dialogue was seen as negotiations. In other words, the Jews were primarily concerned, that is, those who were engaged in interreligious dialogue.
And in what era are we talking?
Well, we're talking about, the problem was, you're talking a very, very, very important essay that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote in '64 called Confrontation. And this had a tremendous impact. And what he said is, basically, that you can talk to non-Jews about social action, about ethics, about working common, but when it comes to theology, you can't discuss it. And he says, as long as the religion of the many, lord it over the few. You see, he says, there's no point talking about theology. Now, I think there's even a more basic theological foundation for Soloveitchik saying that, and that is that he feels that the so-called sancta, however you may want to define that, of every religion is nothing negotiable about that. It's
Right.
like the hukim have to be different from the mishpatim, right? And so he would say these sancta that we have, we cannot discuss, so we cannot discuss theology. My own feeling is that that is a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is because the anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism was really theological. In other words, the reason they became anti-Jew is because of the theology. It's their Christology. So you have to somehow have them have a Christology that doesn't include anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism.
And why?
What's that?
But why? I mean, I understand why it serves us. Why does it serve them? That's the question.
Oh, because they get it better. They get it right. They're distorting. They're really, if you're going to take, what is it that Jesus taught? Okay? And let's do something like what Bultmann did in his History of the Synoptic Gospels. You know, or any of even what the Jesus Seminar does, which is really tries to separate what actually was the earliest apostolic witness and then separate that from what later texts. In fact, a good example of that is Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresy, says that the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew is much better than the Greek. We don't have the Aramaic. We only have the Greek. I mean, so all this scholarly work would help to say, maybe you should really think through how you read the New Testament. Maybe we should take a look at the Greek. First of all, Jesus did not speak Greek. And, you know, there's a whole lot of scholarship saying, well, maybe he knew Greek. That's not the point. Even if he knew Greek, he didn't speak to fishermen in Greek. He spoke in Aramaic. So then wouldn't it make sense if what he's quoting from the Bible, you see it in Hebrew or Aramaic and not in Greek? That's a whole study in and of itself. So I'm saying part of this task is to convey to these other religions, A, that we use similar words, but we mean different things. Let us try to understand what you mean by these words and what we mean by these words. You yourself said, you know, salvation, I mean, whatever we may think the word salvation may mean, it's different. Messiah, it's two different things, right? Revelation, different things. Redemption, different things. I mean, there's a whole different quality in the way we use these words. Let's just sit down and try to understand how we define these words. Maybe I can learn something from you and you can learn something from me. That's why I quoted Lockwood in that thing that I said to you, that real dialogue is that both sides come in learning something that they didn't know when they entered.
Right.
And that happens in an authentic dialogue. It
But
really
Jack,
does.
does that happen in any realm of life?
I think it
Today?
should in a marriage.
In a marriage? What about in political discourse? What about in social discourse? What about in any engagement? I used an example, a thought that I had some time ago in a sermon, this idea that when I was a kid, you had one teacher and 28 students, let's say. Now the teacher's gone. It's now that students are gone, it's 28 teachers. Everybody is right, and they want to tell you what's right. Right? There's the curiosity, the openness to learning is gone.
The only question is you have to ask yourself, why do you think you're right? You have to give a justification. Yes, you have a right. Look, you have a right to your opinion to the extent that you can defend that opinion.
Right.
And if you can't defend that opinion, then you have to give me a reason why you believe it, even though you can't defend it. If the question is, if you're going to have a discourse, then the discourse means I have certain beliefs. I've thought about these beliefs. I'm using certain language to express these beliefs. And if I want to communicate with you, I have to at least describe this language in a way that it is intelligible to you.
Yeah.
If it's a mystery, then I don't know what to do with that. Then it may mean that we can't talk. But here again, I think it's a mistake not to, because there's been enough, I would say, talk that leads to a certain amount of understanding, which has made a difference. I can give you some examples that really has made a difference, that people begin to think carefully about what it is that they're saying and doing, and perhaps there would be a different approach. I think that's true. The very fact that Cassidy could come at the Prague meeting and say, we want to ask forgiveness because we now understand what we've done to you. We never understood it before. That comes from dialogue and study and courageous people like John XXIII, Paul VI, John Paul II. I mean, these are important. And not only that, but Remy Hookman, who was wonderful. He was Cassidy's aide, you know, or Fumagalli, who was Willibrand's aide. I knew these people intimately. Wonderful people. Even who just became a cardinal, Fitzgerald. You know, he was an archbishop. He was Arinzi's guide and help. He was absolutely fantastic. These are people who gave their lives to bring about better understanding. And I think that you have to respect that. And here again, if religion is, as you said, quoting what I said, that religion has to be the conscience of society and the voice of humanity, we have to take the lead in bringing about the kind of dialogue where people are not going to be horrible. Instead of ad hominem condemnations, we should be asking, what do we believe? Why do we believe it? How do we live it? How to make sense of it? Look, the reality is we can't act as if these other religions, especially Jews, we can't act as if these other religions don't exist. Right. We can't act as if what they're doing and what they're saying doesn't have an impact on us. And it's to our own interest that we actually engage in these dialogues so that they understand where we are, so that whatever misperceptions, misunderstandings, confusions that they have with respect to Jews and Judaism, that they would then find a way of saying, you know, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. I now have a different attitude. Those imams that went to Auschwitz were in tears, including those who rejected them. They could not look at these mountains of hairs and limbs, artificial limbs, see where they were sleeping, seeing the ovens and saying, this is a hoax. And they couldn't do that. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to say, look, these are things. Now, it's true that one of the hardest things that we have to contend with is our own Jewish reticence to actually engage in this kind of dialogue. Because unfortunately, by and large, it's always been, it's obvious we didn't kill Jesus. Why do you have to confess that you shouldn't have said you did it in the first place? Well, all right. But then you've got a problem. You've got what Paul says in Thessalonians. You've got what the church fathers say and so forth. So then you have to say, I understand why you accept that, but let's look at the text. Let's look at Pontius Pilate. When I teach first century Judaism, I say, okay, forget what the New Testament says. See what we know about Pontius Pilate from Philo, from Josephus, from Tacitus, from the various, and then say, okay, now what picture of Pontius Pilate you develop? How do you contrast that with what it says in the New Testament? And even the New Testament, in Luke 13, it specifically says what Pilate did to the crowds, Right. So all I'm saying is that we have to have a conversation. And one of the things that is sad, and I'm very concerned about this, Ron, is that there are people who are in the business of dialogue, not in the business of getting anything done. I had an experience in Kosovo where they had this big conference. The local people weren't even invited. The mufti wasn't invited. The archbishop wasn't invited. Some of my students participated in these dialogues. And I asked myself, they're in the business of dialogue. They're not, so they go to different parts of the country. They work for various organizations and they engage in dialogue. I think that we have a challenge, especially now, where you have so many non-Jews who are eager or even willing to know something about Jews and Judaism. For us to really, and here, that's why I wanted to do something. Let's go to the second question, if you don't mind. In other words, what is the place that Jews have, because you dealt with it, of non-Jews? Okay, so we say what the Tosefta says, right? We say what the Noahide laws say. Then there's a whole history of very famous rabbis who actually were very, very good about non-Jews, and say, okay, this is where we place non-Jewish religions. We don't say they have to be destroyed. We don't say they're 100% wrong. We're saying that we can recognize them for the good that they do and for what they stand for that is very close to us, okay? Now, I think you have that in the Catechism. You mentioned, I think there's a section in the Catechism that says, is there salvation? This is the heading. Is there salvation outside of the church? And the answer is yes. Now, if you were to ask the average Catholic, now, John Paul II, God bless him, it wasn't enough to have these documents and put them in libraries. He said we have to put them in a catechism that was translated in over 80 languages, sent all over the world to bishops.
Yeah.
He didn't want to just say, yes, we believe that Jews are our elder brothers. No, he goes into a synagogue and says it so that it was on the front page of every paper and on TV, right? I mean, I'll tell you a very funny story. I was with the president of my congregation shortly after the Pope went into the synagogue. And she said, a very strange thing happened. He says, I got in the mail a chemistry set. And it was like a chemistry set for a young kid. So I called my mother, who was in her 90s, and I said, Mom, did you send that to me? She says, yes. I said, well, why? I'm 65 years old. Why are you, He says, don't you remember what your father said when you were a kid and you wanted a chemistry set? And he says, no, the only thing I remember is that I didn't get it. He said, well, your father said, when the Pope goes to shul, I'll send you a chemistry set. So lo and behold, in the mail, he gets a chemistry set. All right. So who in the world would ever dream that you have a Pope? Look, John the 23rd would be outside. And he, as the worshipers came out, he would bless them. But it took John Paul II to have the courage and the determination to take these documents and not keep them in some library somewhere, but to dramatize them concretely with acts, visiting synagogue. And I must say, Ratzinger followed through. He also visited synagogues. You know, I think this is an important thing for us to understand, that we have to work together because the world is in peril. It's in peril. There's no question about it.
Right.
Just what's going on in California with the fires is absolutely something that's
California, Oregon,
Washington.
I mean, millions of
You know,
acres.
the whole issue of we are all in this planet, and we have to live in a way that can't continue to have conflicts whereby we can destroy each other or we can destroy the environment. We have to say, who are going to be those that have received teachings and claim to live by teachings that are concerned with kindness, with fairness, with compassion, with really an attempt to do the good to somebody else and not bad. That's really the issue. And that's one of the reasons that I went into this. Now, I think that as Jews, we have to find a place for non-Jews, and we did through these statements. I think Christians have tried to do that in terms of their statements. That's not quite as true among the fundamentalist Christians. It is true, I think, among the more liberal. I think it's beginning to be true also among Buddhists and even some leaders in the Hindu tradition. But so the place we have to say is, where are you in the way I look at myself?
Yeah.
Are you simply an object to be converted? Are you an object to be negotiated with so that you can then come to my way of looking at things? Or can I respect some elements of what you stand for in a way that we can find a bridge and a foundation to work together?
Right. Well, that's a negotiated approach to conversation. Right?
It is, but on the other hand, it's not, no, negotiations is where you have a task, you have an end in mind and you want to achieve that end. The end is open. All you want to understand, you want to have better understanding, better communication, better ways of working on common goals. So I really think that's one of the major problems that the Jewish side has had. And I must say with absolutely justifiability. They are concerned with conversion.
Right.
They are concerned with Israel. They are concerned with anti-Semitism. I mean, you know, you don't have to go far and you see the way Israel is condemned. And the condemnation isn't saying that this particular government, I may not like what they do. They don't have a right to exist. And there's something the matter with that. And if religions don't get together and say, wait a minute, you have to make that distinction. And who's going to do it unless those Jews who are willing and able to do this kind of dialogue?
Right. I want to take us back to your third question, and you touched on it now, and then go to a portion of Isaiah for this week. Okay. So the last question that you ask of your three is, how can religions work together for the common good of humanity? I think in many ways you asked that question in different ways now and answered it. This week, we come to this text from Isaiah 58, and I just want to read the whole text and ask you to reflect on it. So here we are, we're approaching a fast. And it's so interesting, the moments in the Jewish year when even the least observant will participate. And that's Pesach usually. Most Jews, whether they're religious or not, will have a Seder, will try and get that Seder right. And Yom Kippur, the fast seems to have meaning for a lot of people, hopefully for this reason. So here's Isaiah's question. Isaiah says, is such a fast that I desire a day for men, I'll say, and women to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast, a day when the Lord is favorable? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him, and not to ignore your own kin. Then shall your light burst through like the dawn. I'm almost in tears when I read that text. It's just so moving. And I feel like somebody's grabbing me by the collar saying, stop and think about the kavanah, the intent. Don't just go through the motions year after year. So Jack, what's your reflection and what gives you hope in that?
Well, first of all, I have two things. One is a comment. When I was asked to make a statement at the National Prayer Breakfast, the last year of Obama's presidency, I chose that text. I chose Isaiah 58 and commented on it. And at first, the people who were organizing the meeting says, well, that's not good. You know, and I said, well, then later they came to me and they said, no, it's very good. My second point is I don't think it's accurately translated when it says, and not ignore your own kin. I know that that's what some people have said, but it doesn't make sense. It's don't hide yourself from your own flesh. And Herman Cohen has a wonderful interpretation on that when he says, it's not just the flesh of your wife, but it's the flesh of your other human being that you shouldn't hide yourself from. And if you look at the context, you see that that's correct, because it says it's to share your bread with the hungry, to take the wretched poor into your home, when you see the naked to clothe him. And it's not ignore your own kin and not hide yourself from your own flesh. In other words, the hungry, the wretched poor, and the naked basically are your flesh.
Right.
I'm not sure, well, there were a lot of places in the JPS, new JPS translation that I think, you know, anyhow, but that's my point. Now, the real question is, what is a fast?
Right.
What is it that you're going to deprive yourself? You're going to deprive yourself of all those things that make you feel good at the expense of somebody else. Take a look at me. Look at what I'm doing. Look at how important I am. You want to be important? Then take care of the people who are in jails, who are poor, who are destitute, who are hungry, who are suffering. That's what you have to do. In other words, it's a false sense of self that you have to reorient yourself. It's almost like saying, what is it that I'm doing all the time to feel good at the expense of somebody else? Look at how pious I am. No. You want to know what makes you pious? To do the virtues. You know, I'm reminded that in Genesis, when you ask yourself, what is it that Adam and Eve, when do they really know anything? Do they know that they shouldn't eat the fruit from the tree? Yes. Yeah, because you're going to die. What do they know about death? They've had no experience with death at all. It's like taking a 3-year-old and say, don't run into the street. A car is going to, they don't know about cars and so on. When do they really actually existentially know anything? It's when they know that they're naked. When they become self-conscious and they know that they're naked and they know how vulnerable they are, how precarious their life is, and they make clothes from what's around them. And those clothes will never suffice. The only clothes that will suffice are the clothes that God gives them, the leather clothes, which in traditional interpretation are the virtues. It's the virtues, it's the Torah, it's the justice and faithfulness and courage and fidelity and honesty and compassion and kindness. That's the clothes that you should have. And if you're going to change it all on this day, if you're really going to be honest with yourself and face the worst in yourself, then you have to understand that the posture that you may have, that look at how pious I am, or look at how good I am, look at how important I am. No. That we should have in Judaism one day a year where we're forced on some level to tell us the truth about oneself, to face the truth. How am I really? What am I hiding from? What am I hiding from about myself? How am I really with the people I claim to love? I mean, if I claim to love them, why do I ignore them? Why is it that I take them for granted? If I claim to be a good person, well, tell me, what are the things that I'm doing that really is making a difference in the world, not just making more money? What is it that I can say? After all, at the end of your life, one should say, you know, have I lived with a certain amount of integrity? That's the question. Now, we have to have one day a year where we ask ourselves, Well, maybe we should have an integrity check, not just a way in which we can say, well, now, wait a minute, have I put first things first or not? And, I think that all of us, I make a point, it's hard. I once asked Dr. Atlas, I said, I can't understand it, how the Mishnah can say that we have to actually call people and tell them, look, if I've done anything to hurt you, please forgive me. I said, can I avoid doing that? He said, no. He said, no. And I said, well, what if I did something and the person didn't even know that I did it? Like I gossiped. Well, he says, you're going to have to find a way of saying, I don't want to tell you the details, but there were times when I didn't say the right thing about you. And I wish you would forgive me. It's a very cleansing thing. It really is. It's a very cleansing thing. Because it forces you not just to think about it, not just to be, self-conscious about it. It's a time when you force yourself to face the truth and what's real. And when do we have a chance to really deal with the truth and what is true and what is real, if not on Yom Kippur, you tell me. There's no other religion that does that.
Yeah, Jack, thank you. You've really inspired me, and I'm sure many people who are watching and orienting themselves to what this week is about.
And it's unique, special, and transformative.
Yeah, well, so has this conversation been unique, special, and transformative. Thank you
so much.
Jack,
it's joy to be with you.
Such
you do wonderful work. I'm such a great fan of yours.
Oh, so am I of yours. And you make me think, as you spoke at one point about integrity and getting to our real self. Well, it's interesting. And I'm not saying this only as a sycophant. I'm such an admirer of yours. But also, my wife will tell you we've always had a pact. And we've always said essentially what makes for a great marriage and what makes for a great friendship and relationship. Pick somebody who's better at the game than you are.
Right, good.
And as a tennis player, I always think that means, I learned this from my parents, don't pick somebody who's a worse player across the net.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
And the person who's been that in my life for now nearly 2 decades at least is Doug Mankoff.
Oh, he's wonderful, yes.
So that takes me back to our introduction at the beginning of this hour. This is somebody I've always thought, I'd come home to my wife after dinner with Doug or whatever. She said, how was I? I said, reliably good. It's Doug. He's such a good guy.
He was that way when he was a little kid.
Yeah, and it's no question why he connected me with you. I'm just so grateful.
Thank you. I am too.
Yeah,
I'm glad. Thanks so much, Ron. Thank you.
Absolutely. Gemar Chatima Tova to you and to Johnny.
Bye.